politically unimportant and kind of are never going to get the investment they need without China giving them this money. Obviously, just getting these countries more investment, which will prove to you will not happen without China giving them this money, is the best thing in this debate. It improves millions of people's lives. The first thing I'm going to explain is why more investment generally is good. Secondly, I'm then going to explain why Panama as a country not only gets also gets more political investment. But thirdly, I'll explain why this is a useful challenge to the United States hegemony. The first thing I'm going to explain, though, is why investment is good. And I'm going to explain first why this sort of investment would not happen in a world where China is not investing into Panama. I think there are three reasons for this. Firstly, just without China trying to threaten United States authority by getting a lot of countries like Panama on side, by doing a lot of investment projects in them, for example, helping build them do this is for a lot of these small developing countries. Like the US does have a lot of like things it needs to fucking spend money on. Like it needs to give tons of weapons to Israel or like develop countries, other countries. So oftentimes countries like Panama or even other countries like Portugal feel left behind by a lot of existing investment programs, are not able to access the money they need otherwise, which is why China is able to so successfully put a lot of money into them and court them. Secondly, I also say like US attention, even if you believe they do some development programs, is likely to be split towards areas that they view as more geopolitically important. Like I think, for example, this looks like trying to put money into poorer Southeast Asian countries to try and help get them on side like battling China or in Middle Eastern countries. So even if you believe that the US is likely to, put some money into countries like Panama, I think like obviously China probably still has the capacity to put more attention and more money into Panama. And I think also just them getting more investment anywhere or more money is still a benefit in itself. But thirdly, China already has an existing program surrounding investment. For example, they have these huge development programs in countries like Sri Lanka, like building ports, where oftentimes they are like able to do like useful stuff for them. So oftentimes I think this suggests that China already has an existing large program that can very efficiently do a lot of this stuff. All of this is to suggest to you that even at the best case scenario, where you believe that Panama is able to access other forms of investment without China, this does get a lot of more investment to Panama than it otherwise would have, because it is often seen as geopolitically unimportant to other large investor countries like the US. But secondly, we've also just explained to you that oftentimes other countries like the United States don't have that much of an incentive to try and invest into places like Panama in comparison to other countries. So this is oftentimes the only investment they're able to get. The second thing I'm going to explain is why this investment is incredibly important for Panama's success. And the thing I want to note at the top of this is like, obviously this is good for Panama, but I would just posit that this is incredibly useful for the world at large for Panama to like gain increased productivity or have like an easier time being able to like do things like build ships or like stuff like that, because Panama is an incredible like is useful in the region in that it can like have ships and stuff for it, and it often like is geopolitically useful for trade with other Latin American countries. So oftentimes if you are just able to get more money towards Panama, it is very useful towards helping improve the economic situation of countries around it, because it just makes trade easier if you are able to like efficiently use boats instead of there not being or roads or stuff like that. I think there are true reasons why investment is important to Panama. Obviously, firstly, this gives Panama's industry a lot of growth. And this is incredibly good for Panama as a country because it means it can develop better into the long term. It means people in its country are able to improve their standard of living and have lives worth of meaning. It is better even if you, like, I think this is by far the biggest impact in the debate, because this is oftentimes like the most important thing for people living in like underdeveloped countries, to be able to have their country develop into the future and get more money. But secondly, I just think it means your country is likely to be more of like a powerful actor in the region, right? Like if you're more developed, you are able to do things like do more preferential trade deals, or like offer like interact more with other countries because like you have more things to trade with, and like have like roads you can do like the trade and stuff with, which I think often means it means Panama can develop long term in the future by setting up more of these. Before I go into my second argument, closing.
Yeah, I love the Sri Lanka example. Why exactly are the Chinese going to do these investments as well?
Oh my God. So, like, I think firstly, as I've explained, because there are other sets that Panama can go to, such as like the IMF or like other like countries, even like there is still some competition for China to do as well. But secondly, even if you think this is coercive like development, I still think this is better than no development at all. Like oftentimes China does do very genuinely good things towards these countries. For example, like building a road, even if you have to pay some of it back because they built a fucking road for you, is still obviously a useful thing to do for this country. Secondly, then, why we get more political investments and changes. So this argument is going to explain to you that firstly, you're often able to, now that, that China is able to challenge US hegemony more, it means that it gains Panama more political importance and means that the US is likely to be able to do nicer things for countries in the region and just for your country at all. Firstly, America now has a direct incentive to do more development for countries in the region or for Panama itself. And this is because now it notices that China is trying to get a lot of these countries on side by trying to develop them up. And it is far better for America to not just shun these countries away and say, oh, because you're allying with our geopolitical enemy, we're just like not going to do any development at all. Because oftentimes it is like useful to try and get these countries on side for like America's aspiration of being a geopolitical power, but secondly, just so they're able to maintain more influence in the region to get better trade deals for themselves. So now they have an incentive to try and do more development in the region itself or to more countries, which is just better for these countries' like economy and also so like these people can uplift themselves. But also secondly, I just think China being even if America doesn't do that, I think China just being your ally for Panama or for these countries is often a very good thing. Like oftentimes they can do things like help with internal issues because like now that you have allied yourself with them, they can do things like send money over if you need it. For example, like they often help out with crime in these areas. But secondly, China is a powerful ally, like a powerful ally overseas. It can help and align and protect your interests politically. For example, by voting with you on certain issues within trade blocs, or by doing things like helping include you within certain trade deals. All of this suggests that the increased political influence that you're able to get with China, even if you're not able to try and like play both sides of the US, still is often incredibly important to maintaining stability like in your own country and being able to protect yourselves. All of this suggests that at opening government, we are able to provide money in people's pockets and also increase the standing of a lot of these developing countries so proud to govern.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. May we have the Leader of Opposition please for the opening up.
Can you hear me?
Adam's here.
Thanks. I firstly want to deal with this assumption from opening government that Panama would not get sufficient investment otherwise. There are three reasons why this is not true. Firstly, because they've had strong financial and cultural ties with the United States, not only historically because they were an important ally during the Cold War, but also because the Panama Canal is one of the most geopolitically important features in the entire world. It is a crucial choke point for global trade. So it is just not true that it is not geopolitically important. Secondly, Panama is one of the richest countries in the Americas. Like it's like the success story of Central America. So I have no idea what this is about. It's like this poor country that needs to go to the IMF. Like that's not true. Thirdly, they have access to the Inter-American Development Bank. Even if they were poor, they would be able to get bailouts from the IADB. So they're probably fine. But even if you believe this is framing, I'm going to flip it and prove why, even if they don't have enough in foreign investment, it is better that they get local and regional development. What does this look like? It means that you no longer turn to Chinese firms to build your bridge, but you hire a local construction company. You get raw materials from your own area in order to be able to build that bridge. It looks like things like instead of relying on the Bank of China to give credit to your companies and to your people, you have local banks, not only in Panama, but also stationed around Central and South America, that actually allows them to get off the ground, that allows them to create business relations with certain firms in the area, that allows them, for example, to slowly build up a capital pool over time and having lots and lots of consumers, which means that they can get interest and shit like that, and actually means that there is a viable financial sector in Central and South America. Even if this is a slight burden in the short term, it is far better for the long term for four reasons. Firstly, it is better for local employment insofar as these companies are far more likely to employ and train up those people. It means now that, for example, Panamanians aren't just at the bottom of the supply chain, but they're also middle management and top management of these companies that have been set up domestically. Secondly, it means that they are not dependent on China. For example, it might be all well and good if China is giving you investments to build stuff and extending you credit in right now, but it's unclear they will always do that. What if the Chinese state-owned enterprise now wants to shift its focus somewhere else and moves its investments suddenly? And so now you're left stuck with the bag and you don't have any local talent that is able to create a bridge. Or, for example, if the Chinese banks want to extend to focus on getting a consumer base elsewhere and is less likely to and is less willing to extend credit to people in Panama and firms in Panama, then you're fucked because you don't have a local financial sector that has actually had the opportunity to grow. Thirdly, because there is more competition in Panama overall, because there are more viable firms. Now it's not just one Chinese state-owned enterprise competing with another Chinese state-owned enterprise. Now you have a burgeoning domestic market, a nascent industry of Panamanian firms that are actually able to compete with each other and against China, which means that everyone is incentivized to lower their prices and increase quality. But fourthly, it means that Panamanian firms can now start exporting the goods that they create and exporting locally in regional in their local currency, which strengthens their currency, which means that they're able to, for example, more easily buy exports or more easily get loans in other currencies because they are stronger relative to those other currencies. So that, I think, deals with opening government. The main substantive contribution from, I promised Eleanor that I wouldn't rebut her, but please don't break with me. The other main argument that I wanted to bring to you from opening opposition is just that Chinese investments are far worse than US investments. Two things that I want to talk about here. Firstly, Chinese investments are far more likely to rely on Chinese employment and Chinese supplies. That is to say, when Chinese state-owned enterprises building that bridge in Panama, they aren't hiring local Panamanians, they are hiring Chinese workers. They are not getting raw materials and input materials from the local area, either from Panama or from other places in Central and South America. They're getting them from China. Why is this the case? I think all else being equal, getting local stuff is just easier and is just more financially efficient. It is just easier to train up Panamanians. It is just easier to get local input products, which is why every other country that invests in Panama does that, right? Which is why the US companies, when they want to build a bridge or a road, that's why they hire Panamanians and train them up. The crucial reason why China doesn't do it is because they have a particular economic problem, and that is of oversupply. Because their economy basically heated up way too much. They invested way too much in certain industries, thinking that there would be sufficient demand domestically to buy up all of those products, but that demand didn't come insofar as China had a population decrease, which meant there was less confidence in the economy and stuff like that, which means that they now just have a bunch of raw materials that they've produced, or they have a bunch of people that they've trained up and just nothing to do with them, because there's insufficient domestic demand within the Chinese economy to actually use up all of those things. And so basically Chinese state-owned enterprises are well, we have to offload them somewhere. And the answer is they're going to offload them in Panama. And so this is the reason why they are far more likely to use Chinese employment and Chinese materials, even if ceteris paribus, it is just more expensive and more difficult. The question then you have to ask yourself is why Panama will go for these Chinese deals, even though this is the case. Because opening government is correct to say, they have to compete with the Western investments, so they have incentives to be good. But the reason, the way in which they outcompete Western investments is by undercutting them, right? By giving them more generous interest rates, by making the deals overall cheaper, but at the trade-off of not using local talent and not using local materials. And given this trade-off, every single time politicians will trade off the local development for more money, because basically the rewards of training up local material, training up local talent and having more of a local industry, that pays off in the long term. But obviously insofar as they are politicians, they would rather just have the money in their pockets right now, because they either need to have campaign for their next election next year, or they're going to be out of office in a few years anyway. Before I go on, CG.
Yeah, you're claiming that Panama is completely saturated in terms of investment and gets all the investment can handle. The actual debate is that you have to accept to get less money. Why are you happy with this?
Yeah, we're fine to get less money as per the first 3 minutes of my speech, because you encourage local development and actually give them room to grow. Second reason why Chinese investments are worse than US ones is because US investments push up regulations across the board. Because when the US is investing, they have to have a couple of people to send over to oversee the operations and stuff. And so they want to secure working rights for those people. Or for example, the investors of those US companies want more pro-business regulation, which means that there's to have more transparency and reliability from the government to make sure their investments are going to be safe. And there are also those woke liberal shareholders that are labor rights are kind of important, right? And obviously because the US government is democratically elected, they are far more accountable to voter pressure. On the comparative, the Chinese government doesn't have any incentives to do that because they don't have any of those mechanisms of pressure. And so what US investments push up regulations, which crucially then apply to every other firm working in Panama, whereas Chinese investments don't. What's the problem? China's always going to outcompete the US because they have overcapacity, so they're willing to sell for cheap, and they have state-owned enterprises which are more okay with making a loss. This is bad in the short term for the reasons I've said, but it's also bad for the long term, insofar as it pushes out US investment, which is hard to come back in, and then they are able to jack up all of those conditions and make it more expensive for Panama in the long term, makes them dependent. Very proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. May we now have the DPM close off the opening case.
POIs in the beautiful chat, please, which I will now open. Awesome. Okay. Panama needed investment. It's the trade hub of Latin America. It opens the world to other countries through the Panama Canal. China gave them that investment. That investment is good. The assertion from Aidan that Panama otherwise could have funded this through its own internal industries is, I think, subject to several questions throughout the debate, the largest of which is just like, this is unproven entirely. But I think I have a few questions specifically. Firstly, they need to prove why they have the political capacity to be able to make these decisions well. Why does Panama have a stabilized political front that doesn't need to lean on the political support of countries like China in order to make good decisions for themselves? But secondly, why they have an economy that is able to do things like redistribute this wealth into areas where it is needed. But thirdly, why they have access to onshore their wealth. Like, the problem with Panama is, although it has maybe a strong economy, that does not mean that this money is able to return onshore and actually get redistributed into areas in a way that is particularly useful or productive. That's an assertion that is unproven at opening opposition. I'm hoping Eleanor is going to do a lot of work on that. But I would note, you should not buy that leader of the opposition case based on that assertion. It is not a debate-winning claim. Firstly, to prove why this investment was necessary, and secondly, to prove why this investment was good. Firstly, on the investment necessary, I would note this provides a comprehensive response to the POI, but I think also responds quite clearly to the opening opposition case. 3 reasons why China does investment well. Firstly, the BRI is an established program. Panama is a recipient of an existing financial scheme. For those reasons, you ought believe that this program is dished out to a slate of countries that are indeed economically and politically important for China. Those are the reasons why this scheme has been done well. Panama is not the first recipient of the BRI, nor will it be the last. Countries on net do benefit from the political support they're given, i.e. would notice that like large examples of Europe, of Africa that have also received BRI support. Secondly, China has individual incentives to do this well. Firstly, they have benefits from working in tax-exempt financial zones for Chinese businesses. This also does things like help Panama businesses and Panama workers that are able to work in tax-exempt financial zones in Panama. That's a huge benefit to them, but obviously has a very direct financial benefit to China, which is why they have an incentive to do this policy well, because they themselves are directly benefiting from it. But secondly, you do allow yourself to have things like political soft power. Maybe that is bad, and maybe that is what opening opposition wants to claim in this debate, but it's not an outlier, right? Like, having soft power politically happens all the time. We see this in the numerous examples where the US inserts itself, often militarily, which we think is far less preferable to the economic and the financial kind of support of soft power that China is able to receive through the BRI and those sorts of initiatives. But you should obviously weigh the practical benefits you get from investment in building bridges over the Panama Canal, which we would note is the bulk of the opposition case, but also investment into a whole lot of other areas that are particularly important that go unresponded to, areas like political framework and political stability, but also areas like the police and providing them support. We would note the example of the massive donations they have made in order to protect Panama communities from things like cartels, from things like the drug market, from things like on-ground crime. Those are massive benefits that China was able to provide them. That is missing from the opening opposition case. If you don't believe we win on investment and the financial case, you ought believe we win on the other forms of investment that provide direct political stability for the people that are living in Panama. The people who aren't living in this rich Panama that opening opposition claims it to be, there's obviously wealth discrepancies that exist within these countries. The people who live in there are not the ones that entirely benefit from the Panama Canal being a successful route between other areas. But thirdly, China does invest in oil just because there is competition with other actors. I think the opposition assumes, I guess, that you get funding from internal industries or you get funding from the US. It's just super unclear why any country would step in at the point at which China hasn't. Like, until China started funding Panama, I want to say in 2018, but that could be wrong, who knows? The US wasn't fucking there. No one was giving money to Panama. Panama had a whole host of issues that needed to be solved. This was a solution that came in. Maybe it is imperfect, but you all believe it was useful. They make the claim then that you get investment through other sources, and they have a couple of mechanisms for this. Firstly, it is geographically important. Secondly, it is a rich country. Thirdly, they're able to do things like go to the Latin American bank. And fourthly, is that it's better to have local investment because you don't need the Bank of China. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, the assumption that Panama banks are able to fund major infrastructure projects is just barbaric. Like, Panama was dollarized because of the fact that local currency was weak, because they were able to fund these projects themselves. Opening opposition needs to do far more work to prove not only they have the capacity, the financial capacity to prove these sorts of things, but secondly, why they have the political incentive to be able to do it. It just seems super unclear what the world looks like on opening opposition. You ought not buy their insane assertions in this debate. But also, it is an economically important country, but not necessarily one that can fund these sorts of products, because the money that is earned often exists at a larger, more lateral level. It's money that goes offshore. It isn't money that necessarily helps people on the ground, but it's also not money that goes into investing in industries and building up those industries on the ground. That's important in this debate. Secondly, Chinese companies have important expertise that mean that they are uniquely able to do this well. So even if you believe that Panama industries have the capacity to be able to fund these projects, you ought not believe that they are able to do it particularly well because they don't have the expertise to do it. And that is because China obviously has the experience of pumping out the BRI in other countries, but also China has experience with working on a whole onslaught of problems. We would note Panama is particularly susceptible to flooding. That is the problem with the Panama Canal at the moment. China has put massive investments into green technology and reducing things like climate change. This is where China has uniquely been able to help them. They were able to put money in towards reducing the amount of floods that occurred on the Panama Canal, but also introducing water security for residents in Panama. These are the sorts of problems that Panama industries could not fix on their own. That is the benefit that you get when you have them. Thirdly, though, the assertion that they only have Chinese workers is just empirically untrue, right? Like, they have a series of schemes that send Panama workers over to China to get things like reskilling and upskilling. That is a benefit. They have a series of scholarship and university opportunities that are provided to Panama students to help them onshore. These are the reasons why China does this policy well. I'll take a point from closing if there is one. Opening.
Yeah, so if you believe that the Panama Canal is so important and building a bridge across it will be really successful, surely a Panamanian company can just get a loan super easily, build the thing, and then make lots of money.
Okay, I'm not going to spend any more time on Panama companies because I feel like I've #done that. So we're going to move right along into why the investment is good. Firstly, you get additional investment that goes unresponded to the debate. You get investment in political stability. You get investment in things like roads that are outside the Panama Canal. You get investment in things like police areas. You get donations in these sorts of areas. The donations are vast. The donations to improve the safety of people in the area. Panama is in Latin America. Panama is susceptible to things like cartel violence. You also get investment in universities and opportunities there. We would note the example I already pointed to of the investment they put into moving Panama students in towards Chinese New Year's and getting them to upskill. But secondly, you challenge the hegemony because this opposition does not prove why the US otherwise has an incentive to intervene. This is why the US did increase a massive amount of funding they provided to the Panama Canal. It is integral to US exports. They need it to be able to survive. They do not want to have Chinese surveillance over it. That is why they invested it, and that's why they improved it. You just don't get that under side opening opposition. But also, it's good to have powerful interplays within superpowers. You establish checks and balances. You reduce the amount of tariffs and policies that exist within these countries. These are huge benefits you only get at the point at which you introduce competition. At the end of this speech, if you believe that Panama needs a thriving economy, you all believe it needed an actor to step in and help it. So proud to OG.
Thanks for that speech. May we now have the PLO close off the top half debate.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Now ask me points in the chat. Sorry, I'll just bring started. I don't think it's gonna die during my speech. All right. I want to start right off the bat with some framing to explain what the fundamental problem is with the opening opposition case. Fundamentally, Aidan relies on an unproven assertion, the claim that the trade-off somehow exists between Chinese and Western investment. We contest this because OO never proved to you why Chinese investments are exclusive with US investments. Like, yes, there may be some bids for which you have rival bidding happening between the countries, but for the majority of the Chinese investments, as I'm going to prove in my speech, as opposed to OG immediately asserting the opposite, the project that China is taking off are the ones that the US government or US investors would never be likely to be funding by themselves. These tend to be the most expensive projects, the ones that cannot be funded by individual investment enterprises, and this is where a Chinese state actor can uniquely solve for these types of investment and construction issues. I first, though, want to basically do some quick framing. Like, this speech is going to have three parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the states, then I'm going to talk about Panama, and then I'm going to talk about China and how China is going to react. Some more quick responses here. Firstly, always say that China has an oversupply issue. This is trivially not true of either labor or building materials. Yes, China has been producing too many consumer goods, but China still very much is industrializing. And therefore, this means that building is never where China is going to have issues. Secondly, though, and most fundamentally, I think all will fail to prove a harm. Note that their bottom line is just, you are now accepting cheaper deals from China. Note how fucking great this is. The alternative for a government like Panama is that you would have to be doing lending, which is at a far higher rates, especially when your government bonds are nowhere near as strong as for larger countries. It means that being able to get a cheaper deal or to get some capital injection, especially during a global economic crisis, is super important. And therefore, I think this means that even the best case of all is not enough for them to win this debate. Into my positive case. First claim, what does US foreign policy look like now? And what I want to prove is why it is that the US government has shifted into a heavily protectionist position, see the last debate, for a few reasons. 4 reasons here. Firstly, the US no longer sees itself as the unquestioned global hegemon the way it did post-1991. So even if OO is right, and you owe these people from the Cold War, this doesn't matter anymore because your position is in jeopardy. Second reason, though, is that economic populism by both the Democrats and the Republicans has questioned the neoliberal status quo. That is, voters are far more comfortable with pragmatic rather than ideological alliances where the other side has to be giving you something back. This takes out the OO claim about historical support. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and the average American voter only thinks of Panamanians as a different type of Mexican, the type that they often aggressively don't want to have crossing the border. The third reason, though, is that the US economy has taken a very heavy battering, both post-2009, post-COVID, and post-Ukraine. This means that they don't want your goods, and they don't want your labor. What this means, then, is that Eleanor only asserts that there are no tariffs on Panamanian imports. I take out the underlying analysis, and this has to beat OO. This is additionally a better reasoned argument than OG's as to why it is that the US doesn't have a reason to help you, because hegemony doesn't imply no incentive. I actually beat OO on incentive. The fourth and final reason, though, is that the US doesn't need the Panamanian government to get involved with the canal. And this outframes both OG and OO. This is because, as the canal is very strategically important, the US controls it both politically and militarily directly. The canal itself is US soil, and this therefore means that they're happy to let Panama go to shit if they have no reason to intervene. Therefore, the bar for US government intervention is very, very high. What is the other important implication of this argument, other than proving that the US government is not a big actor in this debate? Importantly, this means that the majority of foreign investment into Panama that OO wants to talk about for 14 minutes happens through US companies and not the US government. This is already a more important mechanism because I'm going to prove to you why these companies have harmful incentives in mind and why it is that they harm the local economy. Why is the debate winning then? 3 reasons. Firstly, it takes out the OO argumentation because foreign investors in the States are going to be hawks and all they care about is their bottom line. These are not going to be the types of public-facing companies who care about backlash and scrutiny, and you're unlikely to be able to hold them to account. Second reason, though, is that individual private investors don't have the incentive to fix collective action problems. Building a bridge across the world's largest canal is fucking expensive, as is holding up the Panamanian economy when things go bad. When shit hits the fan, these are the investors who are going to pull out, unlike a state that's likely to want to back its past word and to continue maintaining good relations. The last reason, though, is that all are wrong to say that these Western investors are going to be well-natured and use like Panamanian firms to build, right? The thing is that like those cheap Chinese firms that all still worry about are still going to be the cheapest on both sides of the house. That is, given that Panama is literally a hole in the wall, it doesn't have a big economy or a big construction sector, I don't know why any investor would want to hire locals to get these investments done. Therefore, OWO cannot get away by saying that you not get more Panamanian firms, even if they did not have the exclusivity issue I flagged at the top of the speech. Second argument then, why is it then that the current state of the Panamanian economy is far, far worse? And this is crucially because Panama makes a lot of its money by being a tax haven for Western companies. And this is what Top Half misses. That is, it's not the case that this is a huge country with many people or with many exports. The reason any Western investor goes there is either because they want to rely on your very weak employment laws that they have put into place, or because they basically want a tax haven that is very non-transparent and where they can hide and link money. Importantly, this defeats Aidan's assertion that Western investors are pushing for transparency within Panama. The tax haven is the last place where you're going to have more transparency for economic activity. I think that this means then is that you're unlikely to have people who want to make things better within Panama. This means then that these investors currently hold a monopoly in banking activity and corruption that allow them to push the Panamanian government around, and we think China is the only actor that beats this. I'll take opening opposition, please.
So as per your own analysis, Western companies still have an incentive to invest in Panama. At that point, if the Panamanian government has a limited pool of money for state contracts, we'd rather a medium-sized US project and a small-sized Panamanian project on one side versus one big Chinese project.
My analysis is that you barely have an incentive to invest. And when you do invest, it's because you want to prop up the shadow banking sector you're using to hide your transactions. As in, most Western investors won't make other returns on investments in Panama. Note then how China wonderfully fixes all of these problems. One, China is a state actor, which means that you care about like the soft power and the influence you can exert. The Panama Canal is very important, and you want the US to sweat when you're present in the region. Secondly, though, the Chinese government is interested in the long term to maintain those alliances. This means that even if China does debt traps, it's very unlikely to do debt traps within Panama itself, exactly because you want a foothold. Look, if China wants money, it's going to go to places like Pakistan. It's going to go to places like Bangladesh. You're not going to invest in Panama to get returns. China is there because of geopolitical reason. It's cautious of its reputation. And the thing is, it's the only actor that can take on these projects. It's the only actor that can signal confidence, and you're going to get more impacting for this in the whip. I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now to kick off the closing opposition case, may we have the member up. That speech. Now to end the case procedure, we have the government.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Time will start now. Closing opposition's arguments are trite and derivative straight from opening and don't solve any of the root problems or even address them in this debate. Let's start off by talking about what exactly China is even looking for within Panama. First, we would say that they want a foothold in one of the world's largest trading hubs. Second, they want more access to Latin American countries, directly challenging the United States' sphere of influence. And we see that only Panama can provide both to them, which means that there's a direct incentive from the Chinese National Bank to, one, provide good quality loans, and two, have an actual long-term view of what support is going to look like. What does this look like on the impact level? What we see is that there's more banking activity, which leads to investment into East Asia. This is collaborative, so you also see Panama benefiting from this with more capital inflows. Second, you actually see more accountability, because what goes entirely unresponded to from every single opposition argument is that the only reason why Western companies are investing in Panama is because of the shady financial industry. Insofar as every single private company is only going to be building in money, not for bridges, not for roads, not investing in local industries, but exclusively investing in shady banks, which will never spill over and help the average Panamanian citizen. The only solvency for this issue is on our side of the house when you have more Chinese investment, which not only, one, is inherently more transparent, because unlike US companies, which are not disclosing, they're literally doing money laundering and tax fraud in Panama. It is a tax haven, that is the point. You see that the Chinese want to actually make the entire world know this. They want to signal that they are doing good things, and they want other people to see that they are doing good things, which means there's an active, tangible incentive on our side of the house. So, where else is this going to be a very, very clean government ballot? There's a few things here. First, what we would tell you is that they make arguments about how the investments are, the closing opposition makes arguments about how the investments are partially beneficial. You still get some private investments, but this does not interact with the analysis that Chris gives you, which is that the only sort of private investment is not going to be on the large scale issues, which you need collaborative state actors in order to engage with, because what also doesn't go and responded to is that the US government is not providing any of this investment because there's no incentive to. They have control over the Panama Canal already. They have influence in the region already. And because of that, there's no reason for them to continue spending in the status quo. You get this overwhelming characterization from every opposition team that Panama is doing great, that it's very fine for everyone. And sure, the numbers may reflect that, but at its core, the problem that we see is that fundamentally, it's only doing great because of the large influxes of capital to go into the money laundering industry. Your average Panamanian citizen is not reaping the benefits of these foreign banks using the Panama in order to hide their money and take their taxes. That's just not how the system is working. Then, what does opening opposition tell you? They say that Panama is going to go for the Chinese investments regardless of whether or not there's Western investments there because they're undercutting them. The deals are cheaper, but Panama eventually loses control. First, this is pretty cleanly responded to with any of the incentive level analysis from the entire rest of the debate, where we tell you that China has an active incentive not to do this. But then second, we say that it's easy to take this property back in the long term, especially because if China absolutely fucks Panama over, they can go right back over to their best ally, the United States of America, who's more than happy to help them fuck China over again in the long term, which means that there's always going to be better solvency for Panama. And again, at least the bridges are being built. At least there are jobs for local Panamanians. Then they give you that politicians want money for their electability and all these corruption arguments, but this does not address any of the other worries that we actually have about the foreign investment. Elena concedes that China is notorious for bad lending, so if you take these loans, that signals to all of your citizens, that signals to all of your constituents that you are corrupt, that you are actively being bribed. Again, direct quote from opening opposition, just look it up. At the point where any Panamanian citizen can just look it up, this is not a winning claim for them. And then realize that many of these loans are short-termist and will be called in an election cycle or two, which means that there's actively an incentive for politicians to be taking good loans and building good infrastructure projects. Then, on the corruption point, however, we think that any of the sort of corrupt arguments about, oh, we'll give your son's company anything is probably pretty non-unique because at the end of the day, it's very symmetric in the debate. Not only can American companies do the exact same thing if they are investing, but furthermore, corrupt politicians are going to be corrupt with any sort of foreign agency, cartel, or international organization on any world, which means this is not a place that you're even looking in this round. Is there a POI from opening?
Yeah, so these large-scale projects you're talking about are only important and valuable insofar as they're useful, i.e. they are likely to make a large return. At the point in which that's true, why couldn't private Western and regional firms collaborate in order to make that investment? Because it's very easy to get a loan for something that is going to pay off very easily in the future.
So that's a massive misunderstanding coming right out of opening because China's main incentive is not to get a massive return on their investment. We give you China's incentive in every single closing opposition speech, which is one, they want to have a foothold in the region. Two, they want to have an understanding in Latin America. And what we would say is that simply by bringing money into the economy, because more pieces of analysis that don't go responded to at all, is that China does not have an oversupply problem when it comes to labor. They have not enough labor because they're continually industrializing. They have not excess building materials, which means they're probably going to have to use local Panamanian labor. And if they don't, another response that doesn't go responded to is that they're importing expertise in order to have more constructive, and then that can spill over to enable the development of the local economy in the long term. However, what this ends up meaning in the short term is that there is active economic growth. There's employment. People are getting jobs. And unlike a world where only the United States is investing and doing their money laundering and doing their tax fraud, your average Panamanian citizen actually receives benefits from this, which means that one, it reflects positively on the politicians, which gives an incentive for them to take good deals, and two, it probably pushes the United States into actually doing good action because they are always going to have a hand in the Panama Canal. However, right now, they're just sitting on their laurels. They're not actively doing anything with this. We get the analysis about the protectionist policies. We get the analysis about like a post-Trump era where they're literally cutting off the rest of Latin America, which means they actively do need to be spurred right back in. So what are the most important points in this round? What we would say is that this fundamentally, we win this debate on the fact that the US companies are being bad in the status quo. They create bad conditions and they're not helping the average Panamanian citizen. And in the long term, there's always going to be active net benefit when you have increased Chinese investment. You create more jobs, you create more capital, you create more accountability for actual citizens, and you actively increase the quality of life for your standard Panamanian citizen, as opposed to putting more money in the pockets of US banks and business owners. Proud to go closing opposition. Closing up.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now to end the debate, may we have the top whip.
Hi, am I audible and visible? Cool.
Yes, Shubha.
I would like to request POIs in the chat, please. If you say them out loud, it'll throw me off. And I mean, like, I'd prefer you didn't, is all. Cool. All right. I'll be cool. 3, 2, 1. CG wants to call Rohan's case derivative of OO when Rohan is the only person in this round who's given you active, please don't do that, who gives you active long-term analysis as to how we get better funding. Not necessarily better, but more consistent. And we think more consistent funding is probably the best thing in this round, insofar as it means you can consistently work on projects. Rohan asks you, like, would you like to have half a bridge or no bridge at all? It's probably better to have no bridge at all and focus on something that's probably more profitable or something that's probably better for your people. How does this happen? Rohan gives you the analysis on credit facilities that went completely unresponded to. And I'm going to use some of CG's mechs in order to respond to this. CG tells us that right now it is a Western haven for money laundering, some shady shit, probably pretty shady, I don't really know. All I know is that it is major Western actors, major Western elites, and major Western corporations that are taking place in this. This is in a essentially Western hegemonic banking system. What that means is that most international credit ratings are contingent on Western standards. And that means as long as the West is a primary actor in Panama, credit ratings are unlikely to dip. However, what Rohan tells you is that the Chinese banking industry is not only collapsing in on itself, but it also just does not do good risk management in general. What that means is the money is more inconsistent. Why then does Panama take these loans? They take the loans because they're priced cheaper. China is attempting to crowd out other forms of investment sources, right? So when they price these loans cheaper, the Panamanian government or the Panamanian businesses bite. What happens when China becomes volatile or China falters is that suddenly these loans spike up in prices or the funding simply runs dry. What also looks like is Western corporations not getting involved. Why? Because their regulators won't let them. Why? Because the Panamanian businesses' credit ratings drop way too fucking low. Because again, think about cash flow for a second. If I am reliant on a really low credit rated like Chinese bank for my cash flow, then I'm probably going to have a low credit rating as well, insofar as the money I am reliant on is also unreliable. And that means that I, as the Panamanian business, now also have a low credit rating, which means I can't even access other forms of funding. Right? This is analysis unique to Rohan's speech that no other team gives you, but it's also the reason why in the long run we get better funding. Why is that? On our side of the house, we're not advocating like OO for a swap between two bad actors, which is what most of the debate seems focused on. What CG uniquely tells you, which is pretty cool, is that it's not going to be done by the US state. It's going to be done by US corporations. What that means is there is competition in the Panamanian market. That means that loans are slightly more expensive, but because loans are expensive, credit ratings are more accurate because loans are priced accurately. They're not undercut for the purposes of the Chinese government. That means in the longer run, the credit ratings of Panamanian businesses are more stable. I feel like I have to rebuild this case because it went completely unresponded to by CG. But fundamentally, what happens is in our world, you may have more mediocre credit ratings, but you have them for a much, much longer time, which means you can actually see projects through to their completion. But those projects are also done at the behest of the Panamanian government, which is probably best for the Panamanian people, an actor group that people seem to care about. The second thing I want to talk about is a contagion effect, right? Which Rohan tells you at the very end of his speech, right? That also Panama is kind of a large economy within Central America. So when all of this starts to fail, it also affects other Central American countries, which also tend to be slightly more vulnerable in their economies than Panama. So what ends up happening is that you see a lot of collapse across the region, less Western investment. This is probably not a good thing as all of their credit collapses. But secondarily, if someone wants to bail them out, that's probably done in a predatory way. This is probably not good. We may not build the bridge in 2 years, but if we're building it over the course of 10 years, we're probably doing it more consistently, more jobs for a more consistent amount of time. All the other impacts that people want to talk about emerge in the long run on our side of the house, specifically in CO with Rohan's case. Before I go team by team, I'll take OG.
Firstly, it's not clear why these Western companies are engaging in the first place. Secondly, it's still not even clear why Chinese companies get failing scares them away. Surely this provides new opportunities. You don't even have a bridge to sell to Panama.
Okay, I mean, for why Western companies are involved, like ask Chris and like all of his analysis about how like this is like a safe haven for the West and like Western like money laundering or like people want other accounts. There's a lot of Western activity, which means that there are other Western businesses, right? Like for example, if a lot of Western elites are going to a country, suddenly there's a bunch of McDonald's there, right? There is Western involvement. The issue is there's not Western involvement in infrastructure because they've been crowded out by bad credit, but also low price Chinese loans, right? Like actually like look at the analysis Rohan gave you. Okay, team by team. What does opening government tell us? Panama won't get investment without China, and they would rather have like some money than like less money over the long run. I don't really get this point, right? Like think about cash flow, right? If I'm reliant on one source of money and then suddenly that money becomes volatile, I'm probably not getting money from elsewhere because now I look volatile, right? So like just think about cash flow, think about it in the sense of businesses, but also think about it in the sense of the Panamanian economy. The OG arguments just fall flat. And then talking about like challenge to the US hegemony, America has more incentive to invest. Like no, America probably has incentive to like sabotage Chinese investments and like economically manipulate them to go badly, which is just like even fucking worse for Panama. I think like and then they said like why well done? Why this would be done well is because of the BRI precedent. Like know what Rohan tells you. Like year on year, the BRI has been getting smaller and smaller. Why? Because the Chinese economy can't support it. BRI is not being done well. It's going to dry up very soon and people are going to get fucked. Okay, on OO. We weigh against OO, I think, just uncertainty. They talk about like this idea that we're going to see like this battleground form. I don't really think we are trading out actors here, right? I think CG tells us this. Like, we're not trading out the US for China. What we are doing is trading out China for a more diverse Western pool of actors. This is not just the US. These are Canadian firms, French firms, anyone who is reliant on a Western-focused banking system and thus Western-focused credit facilities and credit ratings. They also tell us that Chinese investments are worse than US investments. I think Rohan just gives you better reasons for this because of the actual innate instability of the Chinese system, but also uncertainty with the banking crisis that is literally occurring right now and credit ratings that are literally decreasing right now, meaning that Panama can't get access to this money. And then finally, just on CG, CG gives us some interesting ideas. They tell us that like most of this investment is likely to be private. No, when you have somewhere like this where the West is investing and they want like no transparency, this transparency actually, you throw people a bone, you throw the regulators a bone. And so what you actually do is a lot of these credit facilities are public, right? Because you want to give the regulators stuff to look at so they don't look at the shady shit you're doing. When you have public credit facilities, you have more credit rating scrutiny, which means credit ratings go become even worse in the Panamanian businesses, which means they get even less access to outside funding. You can actually flip this on them, but also they don't engage in any long-run solvency on long-term money at all. No long-term sources of funding. Rohan is the only one that gives that to you. For those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. That also effectively ends this particular debate. Please do leave the room for 15 to 20 minutes. One of us will come fetch you once we are done chatting. Thank you.
Thank you.